Hi, welcome to the next in our series of webinars about the Employers Against Abuse training programme. This one, we're going to be focusing on safeguarding and policy writing, so finding a bit more about what they are, why they're important, and how you can get that right in your own workplace, regardless of what you do and the size of your organisation as well. So we'll start with introductions. Linda, I'm going to go to you first.
Thanks, Vicky. My name is Linda Lewis and I'm the Training and Development Manager for the Survivors Trust.
Thanks, Linda.
Hi
Faye?
there. Thanks, Vicky. Hello, everyone. I'm Faye Maxted and I'm the Chief Exec of the Survivors Trust.
Thank you, Faye. And I'm Vicky Robinson and I'm the Operational Support Manager here at the Survivors Trust. So we're going to start with the most obvious question, Linda. What is safeguarding?
Safeguarding, it broadly relates to preventing people from the risk of harm. So every single organisation, no matter what you do in your work, has an obligation to their employees, any volunteers, and indeed clients as well, that anybody who works within these environments, they have a right to feel safe and protected. And when it comes to safeguarding, there are two key aspects that we need to consider. And that relates, first of all, to adults at risk. So in other words, if you're working with adults and an adult tells you of some element of risk that's going on, whether it's by another employee, because that certainly could happen, that is a risk that an employer has to consider. The other risk is the safety of children. And often people get confused about that because they immediately eradicate because my workforce is made up of adults only. So I don't personally come into contact with children, therefore I've got no obligation. Well, actually you have. And that's only at times where any of your workforce were to talk to you about any potential risk of harm to a child. Now, in terms of the Employers Against Abuse training, this is about having ambassadors in your workforce who are going to be there as a support mechanism for any employee who might be struggling with personal issues surrounding domestic abuse or sexual abuse. And that means that they're going to come and talk to the ambassador, get some support there in terms of some information or guidance on what they can do, or even just a listening ear for the time being while they consider what to do about the issue. And of course, for that ambassador, there will be an element where they have to consider any risks that could come out of the disclosures they hear. When people come and talk about personal issues, one of the fundamental principles for them is that they feel they're in a safe space to talk. So what the Employers Against Abuse training is about having a conveyor belt effect that everybody who comes to you and discloses they're experiencing some elements of domestic or sexual abuse, that all straight away that's up to the safeguarding team or that's off to the local safeguarding hub. It's not about that. It's only escalating much more elements of risk of harm to people. So first of all, if I just explain that there are a number of pieces of legislation associated with how we conduct our safeguarding. And if you look on there, the fundamental principle is the European Convention of Human Rights, and Article 8 confirms everybody has a right to respect for private and family life. And we must always consider that article, especially if we are being a little bit overzealous and escalating something that is actually breaching somebody's fundamental rights to privacy. I'm not going to go through all of these, but some of the fundamental ones is the Mental Capacity Act. So that's thinking about adults' capacity to make decisions, okay? The Care Act of 2014 is a really interesting one because that changed how safeguarding practices were being conducted. Prior to 2014, anybody who disclosed any element of risk, even if it was minimal, it was immediately escalated to a safeguarding team to look at that. And of course, that resulted in many, many complaints. In fact, it also caused a reaction where people were afraid to come and talk to anybody and get advice or support because they just knew what the next action would be. The one at the end there, the Data Protection Act as well, what the Information Commissioner has made absolutely clear about data protection is that data protection is about the privacy of people's records. But it should never, ever be confused with any suggestion of risk of harm to an individual. Okay, so in other words, you are not going to get into trouble if you feel you have to breach somebody's, decision to not, doesn't give consent to disclose. You don't have to fear that if you do pass this on to a safeguarding team, that you're going to get into trouble under the Data Protection Act. The Information Commission has made that absolutely clear. Okay. And the other thing I would say about safeguarding is sometimes it's going to be borderline about should I or shouldn't I escalate this. And one of the key things I always go about is your own gut feeling. If there is a niggling concern, if it doesn't sit right, I always say if you're not going to sleep tonight because it's still going to be on your mind, then that usually is the indicator to escalate. And not to be afraid either, because anybody who's mistakenly escalated it, you're not going to get into trouble. Right. So when it comes to mental capacity, the only thing I would mention there is about any concerns about the person's level of understanding of the information that they're talking about and the information you're giving back to them. It is important to recognise that generally we all have the right to make unwise decisions. We can't take over with a fully grown adult and say, I don't like the decision you're making, so I'm going to override that. So we must always have that principle in mind. And the way to test it is to test with the individual you're talking to, whether they understand what they've spoken about, and especially in terms of the consequences. Do they recognise, you can say to them, I feel somewhat concerned about the element of risk here, or do you see that? And check their understanding. And they might come back and give you some more information that suddenly answers the question. You think, I perhaps looked into it in not quite the right way. If people have capacity to make decisions, then we have to allow them to do that. So if we move on then to the issue about consenting to share information, this is about, you might have a situation where somebody says to you, I don't want you to share this with anybody. However, they've just shared with you some what you consider to be quite significant elements of risk. This is about you considering all the facts that you've been given and making a decision based on that. A number of the disclosures you're going to hear may not even be pertinent to the current time period. They have to be relevant to, is this current, or is this something that's happened in the past and it's now triggered them and they're just coming to talk about it and get some help? So that's the first thing. Look at it. Is it now? Or is it something in the past? It might be they had an experience as a child relating to domestic or sexual abuse, or they might have had a past relationship with somebody. That somebody is no longer living under the same roof. So you can eradicate all of these issues when you're thinking about whether this needs to be reported or not. But if you have somebody saying this partner has a history of causing physical harm, or even a history of intimidation and threats to harm, and they might not be living under the same roof. However, they are turning up at the home on a regular basis. Okay. Now, these are where you've got to think, oh, this sounds more serious. So think about the different elements. And I'll give you some examples. A lot of the time, disclosure we get relating to domestic abuse can be, I believe my partner is economically abusing me or financially abusing me. Well, if you look at that, I mean, that's totally inappropriate, and people have the right to have their own autonomy when it comes to their finances. However, is that an immediate risk of harm to somebody's health? Well, of course it won't be. Okay, unless they tell you that that partner has, has got mental health problems, anger issues, they have lashed out and what have you in the past. So think about the elements that are just not going to be necessary to forward up to safeguarding. Now, in terms of what do you do when you have got that very difficult decision to make and you've concluded that you feel you must raise this as an issue, then I would always urge everybody to always inform the individual. There should never be any surprises. So, what I would say is always ensure that your confidentiality is absolutely explicit about what it means. And so, for example, everything you tell us is confidential unless you tell us of any current risk of harm to self or others. Okay, that's explicit. Make it clear. That way, it puts power back in the place where the employee is, and then they can make that choice, that informed choice about whether they want to go ahead and give the disclosure or not. Okay, and we do that in our sector. It works. We hear thousands of disclosures our members do day in, day out from survivors, and it absolutely works. Okay. So there are three questions that you should always ask yourself. So you might have a situation where an employer is saying, look, I've disclosed this. I don't want you to share it. I am not giving my consent to share. So the three questions you can ask yourself is, one, is the adult placing themselves at further risk of harm? Okay, and only you will know that. The ambassador will know that by listening to what you're hearing. The second part is someone else likely to get hurt? You could be hearing, let's talk about an adult female who's experiencing domestic abuse at the hands of her husband or partner. And if she says, well, I'm not leaving him, I've no intentions of leaving him. And she said, oh, yes, he's lashed out at me. Oh, and we've got 3 children and he's lashed out at them. Now, that's a separate thing. So, whilst that adult has the right to make that choice about herself, the children don't have that level of autonomy. So, we should always be thinking of their best interests. So, even though it may go against the wishes of the adult, we're going to be clear and let them know that we feel we must raise this as an issue. What you can do in that case is also talk to them about the fact you're going to support them. It's about helping them so that they can have that safe relationship with their children and so that they can sort out this element of who the abuser is and where that abuser is staying. And the third element is about, has there been a criminal offence? And this could be around physical abuse, where there's sexual abuse, where there's forced forms of abuse on people. So if you feel there is a suspicion of a crime that's happened, then you can share with or without consent. Remember, that's the law. You can share without consent. I would encourage people to share that you are going to do that. So the key things then, where do I report to? So many agencies will have safeguarding teams within them, so you escalate it internally. There will be some agencies who don't have a safeguarding team, and that's quite normal. If you're in that situation, you can escalate it through your local authority's safeguarding hub. And these are known as a MASH. It's a multi-agency safeguarding hub. And you've only got to basically Google your local authority and key in safeguard, and it will bring up the process for submitting an application where you're concerned about risk to an adult or risk to a child. And I know people who are not used to this often struggle with the concept of managing safeguarding. But during the training, the ambassadors receive all the help, all the information on how to do this ethically and proportionately, because I do think it must be handled proportionately.
If there is a safeguarding team or a safeguarding lead, then that's the first point of call, I think, for someone to go to, and not to feel alone with it in that case, because that could feel quite challenging for someone.
I was going to say with the MASH, even if you've never contacted them before, they are all professionals. They proper know what they're doing. They will take it off your hands almost. They'll know whether they need to escalate it further, whether they need to contact the police, all that side of stuff. So if in doubt, speak to them because they know what they're doing. They know what they're talking about.
Yeah, absolutely. And actually, that just reminds me really to just share what a MASH is and what it does. It's actually a hub, part of the local authority, where you've got different professionals, different practitioners. So you'll have a public protection police officer involved in a MASH. You'll have a social care worker for adults, a social care worker for children, as well as other professionals involved there as well. And what they will do is they will quickly make decisions around any referrals that they come in, and then deal with it and send it off to the relevant team. What I will just do is manage expectations. You don't always get an outcome. They don't come back and say, oh, we've done X, Y, and Z. But for me, as long as I've passed that on, I know I've done my duty in trying to minimise any risk of harm to adults or children.
Right, thanks, Linda. So that's safeguarding in a nutshell. Like you said, we do cover it in a lot more detail on the training, and we've got some links to some really useful resources, haven't we? So we'll move on to look at policy writing. Again, something we cover on the training. What are we looking at in terms of policy writing in relation to the Employees Against Abuse training?
Yeah, thanks, Vicky. There's a number of policies that we talk about during the training, things like safeguarding, complaints, whistleblowing, mental health and well-being, diversity and inclusion, harassment, bullying and abuse, and the domestic abuse policy. And what we encourage employers to do is to have a range of policies in place that will support the ambassador to do their role. We provide the ambassadors with a whole range of resources and templates in understanding how to write policies.
I think all the policies listed there as well, I would say, are pretty much essential these days for a healthy, supportive workplace. Again, regardless of the size of the organisation, they don't need to be pages and pages of stuff. But I think it's these days, with what's available on the internet and all the support that's available, I think every employer can get these policies down and make them relevant to their own workplace.
For me, the policies like this provide a really solid framework to work from, and making sure that all staff are aware of them and make them accessible to all staff so that everyone's aware of exactly the policies that are in place that can support them, and give them a roadmap to follow. If something happens, just make it so that there is a clear, plain language written policy around specific topics like whistleblowing, like harassment, bullying and abuse. Keep it simple. Like Vicky says, you don't need pages and pages of policies. It's better to keep it short and keep it relevant so that it's easy for staff to read and take on board, and then can refer back to if they need to.
Yeah, there's nothing worse than being in a situation at work and just not knowing what to do, not knowing where to go, who to approach, what are my next steps. It can make you feel so lost, can't it? And stressed. And all you need to be able to do is look on, I don't know, your intranet, in your HR office, whatever, and be able to find that policy and think, oh, this is what I do next, or this is who I speak to. It can make such a difference.
And that's, to clearly state in the policy who does what and what their responsibilities are, so that it is clear. I think that's reassuring for staff to know that they've got that in place.
I think it also offers continuity as well, so that one team isn't doing one thing and another team's doing another approach. And the other thing is, sometimes staff may be faced with having to make a decision very quickly because of a level of risk. And so it's really great, like Vicky said there, to access your intranet and look up the policy and the process for dealing with that aspect of their work. And so that takes us on to the next slide, which is just focusing. I'm using safeguarding only because we've used it at the first part of the webinar, about how would we approach writing a document around safeguarding.
And I think, like we've already commented, keep it short and simple, use plain language, and just be very clear about who does what. Make sure that it's accurate as well. Any information about the law or how to manage a situation is accurate and reflects the organisation as well. I think the other thing is to make sure that there is a process of reviewing policies regularly. Make sure that they're up to date. The law changes from time to time, and so to build that into the management cycle, to have a review of policies regularly. And it's probably not everyone's favourite job to do that, but actually once they're there, you're glad that they are there.
I recognise there are industries who come on the train and think, oh, I feel a little bit out of my depth here. And if I had to write a safeguarding policy, I'm not quite sure where I would start. And what I say to everybody is, if you've not got anything of this nature already up and running, we will introduce this policy and it can be done and done quite easily and very effectively. And so I would suggest to anybody listening to this to consider setting up a working group. So you've got the support ambassador as one of the people attending the group, but you might have a member of HR attend, you might have an operational manager attend, and that way you're pooling all your skills. I always say the more the merrier. It removes just the focus off one person feeling that sense of overwhelm. And I know it can work very well. It's a shared approach to how we're going to put this together. And it doesn't need to take a lot of time either. The other thing, there is a wealth of information about template writing for any policy. You just Google it and you'll see it. Every industry, they've got them on there. So do be creative, have a look around, see which one seems to fit what you need, and don't be afraid to change it as well, adapt it to be fit for purpose for the nature of the work and business that you do. So that kind of leads me on quite nicely to the last slide relating to where else people can get help. So we've been talking about safeguarding, and one element of it is that a number of employers might not be familiar with how to set up a safeguarding policy for supporting a child at risk, especially if they don't ordinarily work with children. Well, here you go. The work's already done for you. This is on the NSPCC website, helping organisations to write a child protection policy. Go on to the NSPCC website and just do a search there for writing a safeguarding policy, and it will come up.
It is kind of a boring subject that people don't really want to get into, especially if you start from scratch. It's not the most fun. But once you've got the basics there, it is really a lot easier to update them, to keep reviewing them. Your policy should keep evolving as your workplace evolves. And I think a really important part of that as well is to take on board feedback. So say an incident occurs where you need to use a policy. If an employer says actually that didn't work that well, or that wasn't clear, or we messed up at this stage, change your policy, make sure it's still relevant, and make sure it's fit for purpose.
Thanks, Vicky. I think that's great, great advice there. But also, Linda, I would just reinforce that with the EAA programme, we do have some templates, don't we, that they're able to access once they've completed the training.
Yeah, absolutely. They'll get all the information. We've got a number of different options relating to templates.
Right. Thanks, Linda. Thanks, Faye.
Thanks, Vicky.
Yeah, thanks very much.